Okay, I wanted to tell you a quick story of how I met Sam. You know those hills along Laguna Canyon and El Toro? Well, he hikes up in those hills most days, and it's not easy to keep up with him, especially going downhill. So many months before I met him, the end of spring last year, I heard about the infamous Sam, the 89-year-old at the time, Holocaust survivor that was hiking in those hills. And everybody knew him. If you said, "Hey, have you seen Sam this morning?" everybody knew who he was because he's such a friendly guy. And finally one day, I had the pleasure of actually meeting him myself and got to spend several days with my feet in the dirt walking with him up there and just got to know what a wonderful man he is. And as you can imagine, anybody who's 90 has so much wisdom. And so I found out that he spoke to groups, and I asked if he'd be interested in coming to speak for our group here. And he said, yes, I would like to do that. And so we tried many, many times starting from this summer, and it just wasn't working out. And this room is so well loved that trying to get this room, trying to get all the stars to line up. Finally, this date, January 26th, came up where the room was free. So I asked Sam, would you be able to speak on the 26th of January? And I want to read to you what he wrote to me because I want it to be a quote. He said, "Dear Elisa, the 26th of January happens to be a very important day in my life. It is the anniversary date of my escape during the Death March in January 26, 1945. I'll be very happy to share my experiences with you on that date. I'm really glad that you picked this date. Thank you, Sam." Sam, I didn't pick this date. I think God had a hand in that. So, everybody, it's an honor for all of us to be here today, to listen to you, and let's show Sam Silberberg our love.
Greetings and thank you all for coming and giving tribute to the Marines, and I salute them for serving our country. I want to thank Anissa Livingston and all the friends that participated in making this possible, so that I can tell you the story of what transpired during the Holocaust. Okay, now I know this is going to be a little bit difficult for you to understand. And you can't put yourself in my place, but I want you to try to think about if you were a 9-10-year-old kid facing the things that I had to face, how you would feel about it. And please do not hesitate to ask questions at the end of it. And don't worry about my sensitivities, because I had immunity from being sensitive. So I can answer all your questions without hesitation. Now, it all happened when I was about 9 years old, actually, when my grandfather left to go to the Holy Land, because at his advanced age, there was a Bon Voyage party in 1938, in November of 1938. And during this Bon Voyage party, I noticed a bunch of guys standing around a very serious note. And I was wondering why they are so serious, what they're worried about. I want you to know, by the way, you don't underestimate your children. They're very sensitive to what's going on and respond to their emotional needs and feelings, by the way. And I was just walking around to see what those guys are so perturbed about. And an uncle of mine noticed me at 9 being so curious about it, so he took me aside and told me, you know what they're discussing? They're discussing actually Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht is the night of broken glass when German goons attacked and destroyed many synagogues and killed quite a number of Jews and so on. And that was all during the Hitler era. And he also then told me that, you know what happened? The Germans marched in to Czechoslovakia under the pretense that, to Sudetenland, under the pretext that there are German-speaking people there, so he could march in and occupy that part of Czechoslovakia. And if you are tuned to current history, you will know that Putin, the dictator of Russia, marched in to Crimea, which is Ukrainian territories, and he occupied it under the pretext that there are Russian-speaking people there. So dictators have a tendency to do the same thing all over the world, and you should be attuned to all of that. Now, and he told me, my uncle then told me, you know, the clouds of war are imminent, and if God forbid something happens, I want you to go, and they gave me a lesson in geography to go to Turkey, from Turkey to Syria, from Syria to the Holy Land, and so on. So he ignited in me the spark of Zionism. A desire, when Poland at that time was quite anti-Semitic, and for a 9-year-old, I didn't feel comfortable being discriminated against. Nobody does, because under God, we are all created equal. In any case, he ignited me that spark of Zionism. And lo and behold, when I was 10 years old, all of a sudden, the war broke out, and the Germans marched into Poland, the German tanks and everything. Now, I used to like army, to watch army maneuvers, army uniforms, and I went down to the main highway to see, and I watched as the Germans came and marched into Poland, and they were singing, Heute gehört uns Deutschland, morgen die ganze Welt, which means today we own Germany, tomorrow the entire world. And then they sang, Deutschland, Deutschland, über alles in der Welt, which means Germany, Germany above everything else in the world. And with that kind of goal, they came in and took over Poland in 3 days. And as soon as they came in, they issued edicts in which were very discriminatory, especially against Jews. They also took Jewish hostages in case some harm gets done to a German soldier. So they killed them. They killed an uncle of mine, 2 uncles of mine, and they also took my father as hostage, but luckily the family was able to call all its financial resources to bribe some German officers to get him released. And once he was released, he was almost unrecognizable. That's how much harm they did to him. So as soon afterwards, the German Gauleiter and, and authorities that were faithful to the Germans took over all our businesses and means of making money. And our family had different businesses, and my father especially had a store for men's clothing and students, etc. We also had a large printing house where we printed stuff. Everything was taken over by the Germans, and soon enough they issued edicts that Jewish children cannot go to school. So it was a big problem because I had 2 brothers and a sister. And we were forced to go to clandestine schools which families created in their own homes, and it was incumbent upon me to take my younger brother and my sister to their schools. What was taking place, the Germans conducted raids to gather able-bodied Jewish people to work in Germany in concentration camps. And because they did that, they took my older brother to a concentration camp, and then I was the next in line. He had to have been 5 years older than me. And so it was my responsibility to take my younger sister and yet the youngest brother to different homes. And what happened, the Germans were conducting raids to get able-bodied men. And while they were doing that, they were also getting indigent people and children that they were gathering for extermination. Now, because the town where we lived in was about 18 kilometers out of Auschwitz, and the Germans took over Auschwitz, which was, in Auschwitz is in Polish called Oświęcim. It was a town where there were many Jews as well, and they evacuated all the Jews. So one of them joined my father in our business, because even so, the Germans took over the business, but they forced my father and his friends to run the business for their benefit. And everything was, of course, rationed because of the war effort, subject to German regulations and so on. And the German edicts of punishing the Jews and not letting them survive and make a living got incrementally worse as the occupation took place. So from day to day there were new edicts which were restrictive. Now for me it was very, very hard, because as was the custom, I was a kid, then 10 years old, 11, going on 11, normally I would go to regular school from 8 to 1 in the afternoon. Then after 1, I had to go to Hebrew school from 1 to 5, which restricted me totally from having freedom. And I loved soccer. I loved in the winter to go sleigh riding. And I was restricted in doing it, but I had a lot of knowledge invested in me. It was taught to me between the two different schools. And the war stopped everything. And right after that, the Germans decided on a okay, thank you. That's my grandson. All the way from Brooklyn, New York, here to visit me. With my granddaughter. So we are very pleased. And it is, the Germans were extremely forceful in restricting the edicts which were preventing Jews from making a living and so on. But this was not sufficient. After a while, they set out on a program of discrimination, which entailed, first, on a very primitive way, they would gather Jews and put them into the back of their trucks and take a pipe, take a hose, connect it to the exhaust pipe, and kill them by putting the other end of the exhaust pipe into the closed truck where they kept them. Lo and behold, the Germans decided in Auschwitz, which was a Polish officers' training ground, to establish an extermination camp. So the brass of the Germans in January of 1942 established a means of extermination. And we know about extermination is used for vermin and rats and other undesirable animals. This is the first time in history that a nation set upon to exterminate an entire mass of people. By the way, they didn't only want to exterminate Jewish people, they also had the same rules for gypsies and so on. Now I get this help again.
Is this good? Can someone give me a thumbs up?
Go ahead and speak for a quick moment.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Better?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. It's great to have a grandson that can help you. Thank you. Now, again, but by that time, the Germans occupied all of Europe and breached the agreement that they had with Stalin and the leader of Russia. You know that they had a pact originally with Russia, a non-aggression pact, which Hitler terminated and then proceeded to attack Russia as well. Little did he know the severity of the Russian winter that caused actually the downfall of the German army, because I don't know how much of history you know, but Napoleon made an attempt to occupy Russia, and he was also prevented from doing so by the severity of the Russian winter. But never mind that the attack of Russia. What the Germans did is enslave the entire population of Europe to work in substitute for the mobilization of the German youth to create that huge force which enabled them to think, today we own Germany, tomorrow the entire world, because they attacked. They took hold of all of Europe and even parts of Africa. For all of you that don't know the history of the war and what transpired during the war, that was the audacity of the German people. But nowhere in history did anyone set upon exterminating a people in entirety. The only thing you know about discrimination against a civilian population is maybe the plight of Armenians when Turkey, the Turks, annihilated about 1 million Armenian people in World War I. So I want you to be aware of it. That's only 1 million people. Hitler managed to exterminate 6 million Jews of Europe. Now, I was a child at the time, and our town, being that close to Auschwitz, was subjected to very many restrictions and so on. But as Hitler gathered all the Jews from all over Europe and even made a special railway access to the extermination camp of Auschwitz, and transported in cattle cars men, women, and children to Auschwitz, where they have been exterminated by gas chambers. That's the only nation in the civilization of the world that created mass killing by, under the pretext of taking people into showers to cleanse themselves and put on top of the shower containers of cyclone B12, which was a poison gas, and poisoned them in that fashion, and subsequently cremated them and forced inmates in Auschwitz and Birkenau, which is another part of Auschwitz, to perform their dirty work. They also used local Polish workers as well as some Ukrainians to help them guard the concentration camp and so on, while the Nazis did all the dirty work. For me, for us, it was quite horrible to see and witness this, because we were aware of what was going on because of the proximity to Auschwitz. So I was aware as a child about the dangers. So the transportation of trains, cattle cars to Auschwitz from countries from all over Europe, like Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, you name it. It was so steady that they had to sidetrack the trains waiting to be exterminated. So when I was, by the time I was 11 years old, since our town was already that close to Auschwitz, they sidetracked trains in the railroad station of our town. So my parents got wind of it. So my mother says to me, and I was 11 and a half years old, he says, you know something, I'll give you 2 bags of food. Why don't you go and give it to those people? And they were there in the trains without toilet facilities, cattle cars without toilet facilities, men, women, and mostly indigent people that couldn't serve the German cause. They were there in cattle cars, dying without food and any kind of services. So she gave me 2 bagfuls of food to go down there. I come down there with the 2 bagfuls of foods, and there's a whole area of bushes and so on, and I could see the outstretched hands through the barbed wire openings and so on, and the closer I got, I could hear the cries of desperation and so on, and the closer I got, I even could smell the odor of stuff. It was awful. And I saw the Nazi guards guarding the trains and so on. How do I get it to them? So I went with the bags and I tried to crawl in the bushes so that the Nazis don't see me, and tried to throw it at them, because as an 11-year-old kid, it was very difficult to do it. But little by little, I crawled closer to it. I was afraid that the Nazi guards would see me, so I was very afraid. But I finally got the wing of it to do it correctly, so I could throw it at the outstretched hands. I came home, my mom asked, how did you do? I said, I did fine and everything okay. But I was afraid to tell her about the dangers involved, because basically, to be honest, I got a kick out of doing it. Because I was able to help her do something, and if I tell her about the danger, she wouldn't let me go again. So I did it, it was fine. But because our town was that close to Auschwitz and was part and annexed as part of the Third Reich, Germany, Hitler was really ruling over the Third Reich, and they claimed they can occupy all of Europe, etc. So since our town was the Third Reich, part of the Third Reich, so they created a forced evacuation of the Jewish population to go to an adjacent town and to a ghetto. Basically, the first evacuation was to an adjacent town, which is called Sosnowiec. They had a streetcar and everything else. And as we moved there, my father had to go back to our hometown and run the business for the Germans, but he had no salary or any means of support. So things got a little bit complicated, because as soon as we moved into that new town, which had a streetcar and all this, the Germans decided that they're going to concentrate the Jews into a ghetto, which is a ghetto is a limited geographic area where you concentrate a lot of people. The reason they wanted to concentrate the Jews in the ghetto is because it facilitates their ease for them to conduct raids. If we intermingled with the Polish Catholic population, it was a lot more difficult for them. So they decided they're going to concentrate the Jews in the ghetto to facilitate their creating rates so they can take more people. Now in that ghetto, we had an apartment which was on a hill. We had a basement apartment, and by that time, in that apartment, they had an aunt of mine and so on, whose husband was killed by the Germans. We lived together, but since we had no means of making a living, and food and all necessities were rationed, and the Germans were smart enough that they actually established what is called a Judenrat, which means they would govern they picked Jewish people that were loyal to the Germans, and they would follow the German edicts, and they would enforce all their rules and regulations, including even a militia. They weren't armed, but they were enforcing the German edicts on the Jewish population. So when we were in this ghetto, by that time the Germans already got my older brother, who they took him to a labor camp. So since we couldn't make a living, my father said, you know what, you will go dress up as a Polish student, go down to the streetcar and travel and exchange and deal in goods, because food was not available. People were starving from hunger. There was no food in the ghetto. And then on the other hand, the outside Polish population, the agrarian population and agricultural people had created foodstuff and so on, but they had no clothing or shoes, were extremely rationed because everything was devoted for the German army effort to occupy Europe and the rest of the world. So the local population, both in Poland, suffered as well. So he decided, you know what, since in the ghetto there are many craftsmen who make shoes and clothing and so on. By that time I was 12 years old. He told me, you know what, you will take clothing and shoes that's manufactured in the ghetto and sell it in the outside world, and then you buy food stuff from the outside world and bring it into the ghetto. And I had no idea how to deal, how to do commercial stuff like this. He said, simple. You buy a pair of shoes for $10 and you sell it outside for 13. You buy a suit for 20, you sell it for 24, etc. And I had no idea. And then you bring food stuff. You buy food stuff out there and bring it into the ghetto. Well, first of all, we were prohibited from using public transportation. And I had no way of knowing because it's all new. He said, you learn as you go along. So you see, I want to tell you something about we added. When you speak to kids are very resilient. When you are overprotective of kids, you don't allow them to grow because you're overprotective. They understand a lot more than you give them credit to. And you got to be aware of that. And besides, you know, kids is like everything else in life. for us adults, you gotta allow him to do things, to experiment with things, and you forget, because you're so concerned about protecting them, that when they grew up, they didn't know how to walk, and they fell. But that's how they learned how to get up and go on in life. The same thing happens with every other aspect of life. Don't worry, nature takes a hold, and they can do a lot of things that you don't give them credit for. So be a little more generous about it. I just want you to know that, because they can if you allow them to. Don't be overprotective. In any case, so my father said this, and I went with the shoes and stuff. And at first I didn't know how to do it. Little by little, I brought food stuff back into together and so on. The only worry I had that somebody would disclose me to the Nazis, and they'll catch me, they'll take me into the concentration, into the gas chamber. But I managed, and it went pretty well. As a matter of fact, at one point, when I was bringing back some groceries together, because my father opened up a hole in the wall, separating together from the outside wall, so I can sneak out, because the Judenrat, the people and the militia was collecting enormous amount of money to give you a permit to go out. It's something we didn't have, so we had to sneak out through the hall and so on. So one time when I brought back some food stuff and groceries from outside to the ghetto, this German assessment noticed me and says, "Halt!" When I realized this, I said, "Halt means if I stop, he will take me in, and I'll have to go to Auschwitz," in which I was fully aware of the dangers of it. I started running, then I realized it's getting too close to me, so I had to have had among the groceries a bottle of booze. So I took it out and dropped it on the floor, hoping that he'd pick it up. Sure enough, he did. So as he picked up the bottle of booze, I managed to get into the ghetto and so on. And they, in the ghetto observers, when I came, they pat me on the shoulder saying, "You did a good job." So I got approval from the parents and so on. Things have gotten worse because the Germans conducted raids from time to time. And my father built a hideout. So while the raids took place, so we can hide. So the way the hideout was done, he built a wall by separating. He walled off a certain section of the apartment and put a stove. In the old country, a stove was heated by coal with a baking compartment. And the baking compartment he created a door of about 30 inches, 36 inches by 24 inches. And so that when the Germans come, they realize it's a stove. And whenever we saw the raids starting, we would crawl into that hiding place and so on. And that place was built for 40 people. And then during the last raid, when the Germans decided to liquidate the ghetto, and we saw a whole convoy of German trucks and so on coming. Of course, everyone ran into their hiding place, and at that particular time, in this last raid, there were 22 people in the hiding place. And we could hear, because it was in the basement floor and over on the street, the German trucks roaming around with loudspeakers asking everyone to report on the Appellplatz, which is the assembly place, is a huge open lot, and they asked us to attend there. We knew how dangerous it is, and as we were in the hiding place, not following the German orders, all of a sudden we hear the steps of German Nazi soldiers going in the apartment above us. And as they did, we heard the loudspeakers and everything saying, go to the assembly place. One of the people that hid in the hideout had a baby, and the baby started crying. And the mother was afraid because this is going to reveal our hiding place, put a pillow on the baby, and actually suffocated the baby. And in the meantime, the cries caused the Germans to find out about the hiding place. They took access, opened it up, and opened up the floor above us, and yelled at us and told us to go to the assembly place. Now that assembly place, I want you to know there were 35,000 people in that ghetto. That assembly place, when we went out to walk to the assembly place, of course the woman cried that she lost a baby, and she was crying because she was guilty, because the baby exposed our hideout and so on. There's nothing we could do because we were busy. It was a cloudy day, and everybody took belongings, and when you went up to the street, you could see the people marching. It was so sad to see this, because it felt like they're marching to their own funeral. They were marching to the assembly place. Now that assembly place was so loud of cries, agonizing cries, because the Germans were just throwing babies onto the ground, separating husbands from wives. There were ropes all over the place. By them making selections, and by that time, my sister was in the hospital because she had gangrene in her leg, so we knew she's going to go to Auschwitz. And my older brother was already in a labor camp, so my father decided that I would go with him, and my youngest brother would go with my mother. And as we went to the selection place, and I realized when I saw the ropes and what was going on, and how the Germans treat and divide people, I said to my father, look, I am young, and I know I'm destined to go to the extermination camp. I don't want to hinder you from surviving, so why don't you go, and you will be picked as an able-bodied man. I'll make my way somehow. I'll do. By the way, I want you to know that I previously had a lot of brushes with death and so on. It's just we don't have enough time for me to describe it, what was going on, but I have written a book, so if you want, you can if you're curious and want, you can get the book, and I authorized it and so on. In any case, we were divided, and I see this whole thing. My father went, and I realized he went, and the Nazi directed him to the able-bodied people, and I am left with a dilemma. What do I do now? So next, there was a couple with children, and he was separating the husband and wife, and they started crying and all this. And so I used this opportunity to sneak into the section where my father was, in which there was a secondary inspection. So I figured, look, if the Nazis are going to see me young, I was 13 years old at the time, just about. So he will send me to Auschwitz. Fortunately, there was a construction site nearby, so I took a cinder block from the construction site and took it in the back row, because the rows were 5 in a row, lined up all along. So I took the cinder block, stood on top of the cinder block in the back row, and when the Nazi came with his whip and everything, and started asking people their profession, what they do, and segregated them again. So he asked my father, "Was machst du denn da? What are you doing?" So he said, "He's a Mason." So they sent him, directed him to the able-bodied men. Then he asked me, "What are you doing?" What I'm doing. So I said, "I'm a Mason's helper." So he told me to go to the able-bodied people as well, except for the fact that I did not want to go down, because if you see me stepping off the damn cinder block, he's going to send me back to Auschwitz. So I waited till he turned, and then I stepped down. That enabled me to be with my father. And then we waited, because they made selections of a lot of people. And I hoped that I'd be able to see my mother and my younger brother, which was impossible. So after a while, they sent in trucks, and they loaded us on a truck. My father and I, and a lot of people that they destined to go to the labor camp. As we were on the truck, and we looked over the mass of humanity, and you heard the cries, the agony, the desperate. It was just unbelievably painful. We hoped to see my mother, but you're talking about 35,000 people. We couldn't see it. Then they transferred us to a labor camp called Annaberg, which was deep in a wooded area and so on. My father knew that I am restless, because I have done a lot of things, and I couldn't take the restrictions. He knew I wanted to escape. So he told me, "Look, you don't dare to escape, because the fence is electrocuted." And as a matter of fact, there were signs on the fence in German saying, "Hochspannung, Lebensgefahr," which means high tension electricity, and it's life-threatening, and so on. If there's somebody understands Germans, they will know that that's correct. And he told me, besides, even if you manage to escape, they will find you out and then send you to Auschwitz. So be careful, don't do it. Anyhow, we were in this concentration, in that labor camp for about 3 months because he was a builder. They were involved in building barracks for other prisoners, etc. After we finished, completed about 3-4 months, building the barracks, the Germans sent us to a concentration camp called Blechhammer. There, when they transported us to Blechhammer, in that camp, there were about 4,800 prisoners. And when we got to that concentration camp, they assigned us to different groups where we worked in an industrial complex. That camp too was in a forest. You couldn't even distinguish it from the trees. And that camp, we were in barrack number 15, which was adjacent to a crematorium where they cremated people that were not able to perform duties. They got weak and sick and so on, so they were eliminated. Just mark the word eliminated. That's the German expression. Because they were useless. And there, as a matter of fact, I was issued a number, and my father was issued a number, it's 178-509. I remember in German best because that was what I was called. My name and my individuality was useless and didn't matter a thing. My father was 178-508, which is 178-508. And we were in that camp, and there we were led every day. And by the way, I want you to know that the Germans at the gate of the entrance of the concentration camp had an inmate orchestra playing all sorts of things. You would think you are really hearing something. But that's how they led us from the concentration camp to the industrial complex. We were 5 in a row, shackled. I had to have been in the middle of the 5, shackled on both sides. We went in the industrial complex. I was assigned to a German welder, and he was my boss. As it happens, that welder had a limp. He returned, he was injured on the Russian front, and he was there. He wasn't too sympathetic for what was going on because he had tasted the injuries of war, so he knew what it was. And in that industrial complex, there were prisoners from all over Europe. There were Russian prisoners of war, English prisoners of war, French prisoners of war. We were issued striped uniform. Concentration camp issued striped uniform and shoes with wooden soles. Now what? And we were not allowed to have any contact with the other prisoners of war. There were many other workers there from all countries of Europe. But lunchtime, my boss was off for an hour. We had half-hour lunch, but the other half hour that I had to wait for him gave me the opportunity to communicate both with the English and French prisoners of war. It so happens that the British prisoners of war had a clandestine radio contact with London. So I was aware of, we were made aware of what was going on in the war, etc. Because when we were in Heidelberg, we were totally inside, we didn't know anything. But here we were aware, and we heard about the Allies and so on. Now at this point, in the concentration camp, people were starving because we were rationed. We had no food, not anything. My father was a very orthodox religious man. I, on the other hand, was skeptical because I said to him, you pray to God, and if God is so almighty, how can he allow this to happen and so on? And you can imagine at 14, you are in such a situation with your father and you discuss this. So I told, push came to shove, we discussed. I said to him, look, you pray to God, and the Germans claim God is with uns. So I had to have here a German belt, of German soldier belt, of the German Wehrmacht, that I bought at a flea market in the Harlem, Oregon. And that Wehrmacht it's an original German Wehrmacht belt with it has the SS insignia with the inscription, Gott ist mit uns. I said, they claim God is with them. You pray to God. Now this is a natural discussion to have with your father, despite my age. But I was a lot more mature than my age because circumstances caused it. So and I was also very desperate. So I'm going to show you this belt. You can get it around, but please get it back to me when you're finished. Look at that buckle. So he says, and I was pretty desperate because I wanted to escape badly. And I was able to communicate with the prisoners of war and so on. Now the only way you could escape when you are there is if there was an Allied bombardment, because by that time Allied planes came by and there were alarms. There was an Allied bombardment and they bombed. Then it's assumed you were killed by the bomb. Then there were no repercussions to fellow inmates. Otherwise, if a prisoner escaped, they would kill 10 other inmates. And sure enough, if I did, they'd kill my father. And it so happens that during one of the alarms, there was an alarm one day, and I escaped. I was out of the industrial complex and everything. The damn planes flew by and didn't bomb. And so I was left with a dilemma. What the hell do I do now? You can imagine when you are 40 years old to have such a dilemma. Sure enough, I came back because I knew they're going to kill 10 others. So I came back. And then I told my father what happened. We had a big discussion, so my father tells me, you gotta be careful, you can't run away. Look, people were fighting when they issued soup from the kettle to get the last morsels. Maybe there's a piece of potato or carrot there. People were fighting over it and all this. And people were dying from hunger and starvation. And I said to him, this is not something I want to go through and do. I gotta do something, I gotta escape. And we had this discussion back and forth. And I said to him, look, what the heck am I going to do? I'm going to work for the damn Germans, then starve, and anyhow, I might just as well commit suicide. So he kept talking to me, and then he said, look, let me tell you something. You got to believe that God is going to help you, but I know you have a contentious relationship with God. So I'm going to tell you a story about two flies that fell into cream. One of them was a believer, the other one was an unbeliever. Or he said, oh, you are not a believer, so I'm going to say one of them was an optimist, the other one was a pessimist. The pessimist had no faith in God, nothing, and drowned in the cream. The other fly was an optimist, a believer. He said, I got to do something to get the hell out of here. He started kicking the legs and flapping the wings back and forth until he made butter out of the cream and got out. So let that be your lesson. It's better to be an optimist than a pessimist. It's always better to see the bottle half full than half empty. And he was right. And after this, things were happening, and still the concentration camp was awful. One day, I'm limited in time, so I gotta move on. One day, we were walking in the winter, in the snow of 1944, as they were leading us back from the industrial complex to the concentration camp in the snow, and luckily I was able to finagle by contacting French prisoners of war and others, get a French sweater and leather shoes, because the wooden soled shoes, which was the German issue, collected snow at the bottom. When you walked, you would bubble and fall, and the Germans would shoot you. So I was fortunate that they got shoes for me and my father by the exchange with other prisoners of war. And lo and behold, we were led by the Germans, and I'm shackled in the middle. All of a sudden I see a woman walking in the snow, which was really unbelievable, and I recognized the coat was that of my mother. And as we get closer, I realized it's my mother, so I nudged. Since I was shocked, I nudged the guy next to me. I said, this is my mother. He said to me, shut up, because if you keep loud enough, the Germans will take her. Well, it was my mother. She managed to put her contact information to a contingent where my father was part of, and so on. So the Jewish guard didn't let us walk out the next morning to work and so on, but we got the information. Now the problem is, how do you get in contact with her? What's going on? Actually, she was working as a non-Jew in a town called Neustadt, which was about 18 or 20 kilometers away, whatever. And as a non-Jew in a monastery which served all the German people and so on. It was a Catholic monastery. She didn't know she was Jewish. You see, in Europe, the only people that were circumcised were either Jews or Muslims. I mean, the Germans didn't do anything to Muslims, but they certainly did to Jews. And so the Jewish male had a problem because of the circumcision. That's how he would be identified. Women were more able to slip behind the game. In any case, now the question was, who's going to contact her? We couldn't find a contact. My father tried here and there. So he finally says to me, you know what? Maybe you speak to your boss. I said to him, look, what am I going to tell him? He says, look, you tell him you have an aunt someplace. Test him out, see what he's going to do. So he said, tell him you have an aunt someplace that you know she might be in the monastery. Would he contact her and so on? I did speak to my boss. I called him Herr Schrank. Herr means Mr. in English. And he said yes, he would go. And as a matter of fact, he did go. And he brought back a whole bunch of goodies and food and so on. And my father goes to me, you see, if you have hope and you have faith in God and you're optimistic, you can reap the fruits and so on. I love my father, and I want you, by the way, I want you to know that today happens to be the 75th anniversary, which I separated my father, which I'll tell you a little later. Now, I won't hold you too long. I'm going to try to expedite it. He said to me, you see, if you have faith, you can get, it helps you get to where you want to get. Don't be defeated. He was a godsend to me. I loved him so much. In any case, but the conditions in the camp, even so we had some food that my mother sent through this boats of mine, were awful. People were dying of starvation and so on, were cremated. And you live and smell this sweet smell of death from eliminated from the crematorium and so on. In any case, things got worse. Come January, I'm rushing through this quickly. Come January of 1945, actually January 26th of 1945 is today, 75 years ago. But on January 21, when we heard the Russian artillery, and we were hoping, oh, soon enough, they're going to come in and liberate us. Because we were next to a river called the Oder River, but the then Russian artillery stopped. The Russian onslaught stopped, and the Germans decided to evacuate deeper to Germany to build trenches. And that evacuation, I said to my father, let's hide in the attic of the barracks and so on. So my father said, we can't do it because our barrack was next to the crematorium, and sure enough, they're gonna put explosive at the crematorium and everything is gonna blow up. Anyhow, so we had to join. They decided to evacuate 4,800 prisoners that were in the concentration camp of Breslau. I want you to know that only 800 made it to destination. 4,000 perished on the way. the death march entailed walking in the snow without food or anything. Luckily, we were allowed, we were able, we were ordered to bring our metal canisters with us. So the only means of survival we had is by loading the canisters with snow, melting them on our belly, and that's how. And then, as they melted, we had the water that sustained us. And every night, come the evening, the Germans would force us into abandoned German villages, the barns, and force the prisoners from the back. So they created a stampede, induced stampede. A lot of prisoners died as well. But we had no food, nothing. And we walked for a few days. Actually, the 21st was a Sunday. We walked like this. It was horrible. People were dying. It was so hard to walk. The blanket that I had, I could throw away the blanket in the morning and rely on being able to pick up a blanket towards the evening from some corpse on the road. That was the lifestyle that we lived. And I'm going to share something with you. On the third day of the march, where people were literally starving to death, a German peasant threw a bucket of root potatoes, which are that small, to the prisoners. Now, my father was a very gentle man because he maintained his dietary religious laws and everything. But when I managed to get one little potato like this. And I remember like today, we were starving. And I hesitated whether I should share it with my father. And I'm proud that I overcame my animal instinct and I shared it with my father. That's my one of my proudest things in life. And as we were marching that evening, we saw signs saying Neisse Neustadt, 24 kilometers, which is the place where my mother was in the monastery. So I said to her, let's hide out in the snow, in the barn, in the hay. Lo and behold, the next morning we were going to hide in the hay. You know, we were exhausted from the day's march without food and so on. People started to get dysentery and starving all over the place. The Germans opened the barn doors with the crack of dawn, so we didn't manage to hide, and so we went. Lo and behold, come Friday, the 26th of January, they marched us out from the barns from the village onto the main road. They halted us on the main road. It so happens. And then, as they halted us, we saw convoys of the German army and so on. A lot of Germans running away from the Russian occupied. They don't want to be occupied by the Russians. They were running away towards the American front. So because the Americans are going to treat them better than the Russians had a lot of revenge to take place of what the Germans did in Russia. They were cruel to the Russians as well. And as we saw them, they halted us right on before the main road and the villages, because There were convoys, and there was a contingent of French prisoners of war walking by. And while they halted us, my father, who was very religious, and it was the anniversary of my grandfather's death. So according to Jewish practice, he said a morning prayer and to honor his father. And as he was saying that prayer, I saw the SS guard turning to his sled where he had his belongings and so on. I threw off my striped uniform because I was not allowed to have a French sweater and all this, but I threw off my striped uniform, poked my father on the shoulder and said, "Dad, I'm going." And I went. And there was a bunch of German kids standing around, watching the spectacle. And I said in German, "Ach, die verfluchte Juden, die sind schrecklich." I said, and basically I said, "You lousy Jew bastards," and so on, just so that they don't think I'm one of them. And I know I was too young, and then I had this French sweater and all this, with something over my head, because my head was shaven. Not only was it shaven, it was in the middle, it had a thing, what the Germans called the Lausenstraße, which means the street for lice, to be on. So I had something to cover my head and so on and snow. So I looked like a French prisoner of war. And I kept walking. I went out, I managed to go out to the other side. By then I was stricken by dysentery. There was a pile of snow, so I went in the back of the pile of snow to relieve myself. And I passed out. I don't remember what happened, for how long and so on. Finally I got up and I joined all the German civilians and all this, walking away. And as I walk away with the Germans and going away, I realized there was a French prisoner of war, which was a chef, a horse-driven sled with a kettle on it, the food for the French prisoners of war. And as I saw go by and I smelled the food, and I was starving, I went on the back of the kettle. I stood on the stoop at the back of the kettle, and the front was the German guard and the French chef, which was a prisoner of war. And so I go up on the stoop and I poked the French chef, and I told him, "Je suis monsieur, s'il vous plaît, pas de pain." I told him, "Look, I'm Jewish, would you please give me a piece of bread," and so on. Now I want to tell you something. He gave me a bowl of soup with melted cheese and a piece of bread. Heaven never tasted like that. It was just unbelievable. The only thing I thought that if I could only share with my father, which he might not have eaten it anyhow, because he believed in kosher food and all that. Anyhow, I keep walking, and there's this German woman telling me how the Jews are financing the war and so on. And I had to keep my mouth shut. It was pretty difficult. In any case, in the meantime, Russian planes kept flying over to bombard and shoot on the German convoys. So when this happened, we had to spread into the field. So I lost her. And then after the planes flew by, We went back on the road, we kept marching, then I marched with another woman. As a matter of fact, part of the way I caught on to a glide, because it was snow, so it went a little faster. And I say, and the German woman was local, so she knew. So she told me, Neustadt is now about 12 kilometers from here, and so on. And she explained to me that Neisse is a river, and so I was delighted that it's that close. And since I kept on the back of a sled driven by a horse, that expedited matters. They veered off just bore I came to a bridge. I didn't know it was a river, and there's a bridge there. And then on the bridge there was a German sentry, and asking for IDs. I mean, what the hell am I going to do now? I have no idea, nothing. So I come to the bridge into the sentry, and I was almost shaking. And he said to me, Ausweis bitte. Give me a little, show me ID. And so on. So I finally said to him in German, trying to say it with a French accent, I said to him, ich nix kein Ausweis, I don't have any ID, and so on. I was with the peasant, and as the Russians, the peasant had all the papers, because the Russian planes came shooting up on the convoys, and we lost each other while we were dispersing in the field and so on. I don't have Ausweis. Kept arguing back and forth. Then he says in German, "Ach, that's the Holocaust, we must get the hell out of here." Then I understood right away, and I went out. So I come, I go out, I'm afraid to ask out, to ask some kids where Klosterstraße. Klosterstraße means Monastery Street 12. That's where my mother was working. So he says to me that Obernkirche right up by the church, go to the right side. I go to the monastery. Don't forget, you see a kid that was raised in a Jewish tradition at home. All of a sudden I come, I open the door to this monastery. Everything is sparkling clean. I see this beautiful wooden banister and so on. And to the left of me is this cross with Christ. And I'm scared as hell to divulge this, where my mother is. So I go, you see this Jewish raised kids go, I walk in behind the statue of Christ, shivering, hoping, I don't want to divulge who my mother is and so on. I don't want to expose her or endanger her. And I'm waiting there, shivering. Now, how I was protected by the cross, that's quite a situation. And then I see this woman walking down the stairs with a tray and a white uniform and so on, because the Germans were spick and span. And I wait, in the meantime, I'm just shivering, waiting. The woman comes back. She was, so I was afraid, so I finally asked her in German. I said, Entschuldigen Sie mich bitte. Excuse me, please. Do you know a certain woman by the name of Barbara Siegmund? She comes to me, she says, ja, ich bin das sind Sie eigentlich. She said, I am the one, who are you actually? I said, Mama, don't you recognize me? I was then, that was 2 years apart. I grew up, I was taller than her and so on. Concentration camp conditions notwithstanding, I grew. Anyhow, so and immediately the animal instinct. He had a tray of cookies and tea for a chauffeur that came to take some indigent German parents towards the American zone. So she served on the chauffeur. So anyhow, when she realized this, she told me, get out, I'll take you to a hideout to an aunt of mine who was also iron papers in another monastery. They had a summer residence and so on. So she took me there, and for 2 months I was waiting. That was an agricultural monastery where they had cows and so on. My aunt was milking cows, so she was able to feed me with the milk and so on. There were 2 other escapees. Unfortunately, it wasn't my father. We waited there, and by the way, I came back because there were abandoned apartments because the Russian planes shut out the roof of the barn where she hid us. So we went to an abandoned German apartment near my mother's monastery, and when I visited the monastery, the priest was conducting mass, and so I had no choice. I had to take the wafer. You can imagine this to take away from the mass. I did because I didn't want him to think I'm a heathen. And anyhow, so I take this, and the Russian artillery is going back and forth and so on. Finally, by March, we were liberated by the Russians. There's a whole story, a lot of stuff was involved, because we had to get rid of the lice nets we had on our bodies and so on. And we were liberated by the Russians. After the war, we were made our way back to Poland. It was quite intricate, quite convoluted, but we made it. And well, I'm indicating my time is running short. So we were liberated by the Russians. We finally got back to Poland. We realized we couldn't get into our apartments and our houses because they were occupied by Polish, and the communists occupied Poland. It was very bad, and I was very frustrated. So I said to my mother, you know what? We went to Krakow, and I met a young guy who was in the orphanage in Budapest, which was run by a Zionist organization. He told me you could go with me there, and we are going to go to Palestine. That enticed me to go to the Holy Land and so on, so I get rid of discrimination, etc. And I discussed it with my mother. My mother said, okay. And we made plans with the guy to meet him a week later at the railroad station. We go from there to Budapest. My mother came, escorted me to the train station, and as the train was almost going to move out, she started crying. She says, don't leave me in all this. And I said to her, look, Mom, maybe you could afford to lose a husband and 3 children. I don't want it to happen to me, and I got to go and do what I got to do. And subsequently, I felt very bad about it. I went through a lot of crap because I didn't have an education. And when I came to that orphanage, all those kids had normal school and so on. So I had an inferiority complex, which I managed to overcome. We went finally from there, and we smuggled a bunch of orphans back from the Russian occupied to the American occupied zone. And Christmas Eve or New Year's Eve of 1945. From there, we were clandestinely taken to France, where we were hidden in Saint-Jerome, which was an abandoned house, because we were hiding from the British intelligence forces, which didn't allow Jewish kids to go to Palestine, because the British Empire was interested in our interest, in our oil, etc. Lo and behold, I'm making it real quick. Lo and behold, we were transported one night to South, which is the Spanish border of the Mediterranean. We went for legal ship to Palestine. We were intercepted by the British. The British took me to Cyprus for 6 months. I was deported to Cyprus. Then in August of 1947, Her Majesty the Queen allowed 500 orphans to go to Palestine. By then I had the broken leg in training that I was sworn in to the Haganah, which is the Israeli armed forces. And I came to Palestine to a kibbutz. A kibbutz is a cooperative settlement. I was an idealist. By the way, you know, Churchill said, if you are not an idealist at 18, you got no heart. If you're an idealist at 40, you got no brains. So just bear that in mind. In any case, I was there, and then I left the kibbutz and worked my butt off to get money to build a house. And overnight, there was an evaluation. The money wasn't worth anything. So I decided to come and visit my mother, who went from Europe to the United States, and come here. So I came here, and I was able to get into college through different machinations, because I didn't have a high school diploma, and so on. If you want, you can read it in the book. And finally, I graduated in 1957 from college. In the last year of college, I got my high school diploma, because I got a high school equivalency diploma, and my BS degree at the same time. And now I'm happy here. I was married, my wife is here, my 2 grandchildren are here, and all my friends are here. Thank you very much. Thank you.